Oh, I am Gabrielle Holcomb. I work for the Department of Energy and will be speaking to you today about counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. Specifically, this module will address managing supply chain risks. The agenda for this module is divided into 6 sections. Section 1 is the introduction. Section 2 is developing a plan. Section 3 is analyzing and rating risks. Section 4 is assessing risk processes and controls. Section 5 is mitigating risks. And Section 6 is preventing counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. In this first section, the introduction, how many of you know or understand supply chain risk management? First, what is supply chain risk management? The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, defines supply chain risk management as a systematic process for managing supply chain risk by identifying susceptibilities, vulnerabilities, and threats throughout the supply chain and developing mitigation strategies to combat those threats, whether presented by the supplier, the supplies, products, and its subcomponents, or the supply chain, such as initial production, packaging, handling, storage, transportation, mission operation, and disposal. Each area shown here, such as environmental risks, including hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, sources of supply, such as risky suppliers, fraudulence, or conformance issues, controls, such as poor quality controls, inspections, tests, and inventory, etc., safety processes, such as a worker getting hurt or killed on the job, or work shutdown, processes, such as poor material handling, shipping, packaging, storage, controls that cause damage, and regulatory requirements, such as missing, incorrect, inadequate, can all contribute to supply chain risks. Why do you think it's important to manage supply chain risks? Please pause the video at any time for group discussion if needed. There's no wrong answers, and participation is always encouraged. Have you ever experienced a supply chain shortage? Have you ever experienced a significant supply chain delay? And have you ever received a substandard, suspect, or counterfeit product, even if at home? These are some very important considerations and great discussion points if you're having this training as a group. Another group discussion, and please pause the video to discuss as a group. Do you think that counterfeit, suspect, and fraudulent items would be considered a supply chain risk? And why? There's no wrong answers. Have you experienced a major recall? Do you suppose that this looks good or bad to a broad brand owner when they have to issue recalls? Have you ever experienced a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item? And if so, did this impact your project or program? Did it impact the costs of rework performed? And do you think that a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item could impact your work? These are just some important questions to ask, especially if you're doing this training as a group. This slide represents the high-level risk mitigation process that we will be reviewing today. This short process will be separated into much smaller segments for each step and for you to better understand all the elements. Ultimately, the risk mitigation process goal is to create a list of risks, rate those risks, assess your processes and controls to see what gaps may exist in addressing the risks, and then produce an action plan or strategies to lessen the effects of potential threats. In the next section, we will discuss the risk planning process in depth. The risk planning process will address all these components, but at a much more strategic level. Now, at section 2, the objective for this section is to discuss the stages of risk planning. The goal is for attendees to learn about counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item risk mitigation planning stages. This section is all about risk planning. Throughout this section, I would like you to consider or think of creating a risk plan for your organization or for a specific project. Think about the elements that you would want to address in that plan. I would also like you to consider that often a risk plan is completed at an organizational level, but it may also be completed on a project by project basis to identify if additional controls are needed for a project besides what is already in place at the organizational level. We are going to discuss the four stages that are typically used to develop a risk plan, which include the first stage, identifying the risks, the second stage, preventing and detecting counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. The third stage would be controlling and managing processes that will prevent and detect counterfeit and fraudulent and suspect items. And the fourth stage is reporting and analyzing trends of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. And this can include other processes. Let's look at each stage in more depth. Stage one of our plan is for identifying risks. In this stage, we might define and document the following elements: roles and responsibilities, graded or risk based approach, the risks, and how we will train personnel. On the next slide, we'll look at each of these areas in more depth. It may be important within organizations to reduce or prevent risks by defining roles and responsibilities at a level which is suitable for the work being performed. Actions for individuals should also be defined. A graded approach or a risk based approach may be defined by an organization and can be based on many factors, such as organizational and business needs. This could be the organization has determined that there are certain risks that are specific to the business environment and may not necessarily affect safety or security, but could impact the integrity, reputation, or investor relations. There may be health, environment, safety, or other risks or hazards that can define an approach to grading as well as best practices or operating experience that has been trended and analyzed over time. This can be internal or external to the organization, but can benefit the organization. For instance, federal organizations throughout the United States often publish information on lessons learned, best practices, or other operating experience that can be shared internal to their agency or amongst many agencies and the general public to garner awareness around various topics. A graded approach or risk based approach may consider what factors. Pause the video to discuss if performing training in a team setting. Some potential answers might include organizational or business needs, the risks or hazards, or best practices. Performing a risk analysis for counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items will weigh consequence or impact against the likelihood of occurrence. We will discuss this process in more depth in the Analyzing and Rating Risks section of this training. When performing a risk assessment, you weigh the likelihood against what? Pause the video to gather any answers. The answer is impact. In stage two, we will be discussing preventing and detection processes, which include the following: source of supply, acquisition clause and use, and verification, inspection, and test plans. Our first element to consider in preventing and detecting in stage two is assessing source of supply and supply chain. This would include developing processes and procedures for acquisition personnel to follow that would help to identify or prevent the purchase of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. When developing processes or procedures, we need to think about basic supply chain risk. The more steps between a manufacturer to the end to the supplier, the higher the risk. On this chart, you can see that the lowest risk is when procuring items from manufacturers, such as original equipment manufacturers and original component manufacturers. This does not mean zero risk, since fraud can occur anywhere and has, but the risk is typically lower. As you go through the chain, the next level of lowest risk resides with the manufacturer's authorized or franchise distributor. These are usually distributors that only sell the manufacturer's goods. To identify an authorized distributor for a manufacturer, you will usually go to the manufacturer's website to find a list of sellers. This is especially true if the manufacturer does not distribute or sell their own goods. Many manufacturers now have warnings to only buy from their dedicated list of sellers, or you risk buying a counterfeit or fraudulent product. Manufacturers are also starting to inform consumers and offer counterfeit support hotlines. I always recommend going directly to a manufacturer's website for commercial off the shelf products whenever you find a product that you would like to buy. This will give you insight about the potential price, sales locations, and even other detailed information such as specification sheets that might not be available from other sources. As we continue down the list, we can see contract manufacturers. Contract manufacturers are the manufacturers that are contracted out by the original manufacturer to produce their goods. There is higher risk with contract manufacturers because of issues such as overproduction, or what may be called moonlighting, where there is a shift that is dedicated to the counterfeit or overproduction and potential knockoff or cheaper versions of the genuine products that they produce on their other shifts. These cheaper versions may use substandard materials and forego the normal quality processes. Then we have independent distributors. These are distributors that may sell many different goods. They could sell primarily for a specific manufacturer, but will likely sell many different goods for many manufacturers and are not loyal to just one specific manufacturer. There is more risk with independent distributors because they may or may not use authorized distribution channels. It is important if you use this type of distributor that you perform more verification of their sources. The next source of supply is a broker. Brokers may be individuals, a group of individuals, or an entire company. Brokers will usually work to find your products from anywhere to fill a demand, which is why they may have a much higher risk. They may not be aware of the counterfeit issue or may work with sources that are less reputable to meet your demands. Lastly, we have the unknown or individual seller. These sellers may be individuals or companies, but there is often little verification for their business available because they are selling through an e-warehouse site, online, or other platform that may obfuscate their information. That is why these sources are the highest risk, and why platforms such as e-warehouse sites, social media, or other online retailers should be used with the highest caution. This is only one example of many potential scenarios. This also excludes other logistic factors, such as shipping. In this scenario, the business decided to buy an item online from an independent distributor. Independent distributors are known to distribute products for many different manufacturers and may lack controls over inventory that authorized distributors and manufacturers may be required to maintain. This could risk introducing counterfeit items accidentally, or in this case, purposefully. This could be known or unknown to the management or owner of the distribution company. This type of scheme is often completed to save money, create a source of financial gain, or boost stock due to shortages. If you are working to prevent using this supplier upfront and only assess the direct supplier, it will likely be missed that the distributor is using a warehouse that receives substandard and counterfeit materials. It is important to understand that some of the potential vulnerabilities in the supply chain, such as in this case. If you were to procure from this supplier, it is likely that you will find non-conforming, substandard, and counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item materials. And if monitoring this supplier could determine the issue after some time, you may question, how can I assess a supplier that is not my own? You can do this when you assess your direct supplier. Ask questions about how they assess their supply chain and verify that your business is flowing down clauses that require your direct suppliers to perform assessments. You can also flow down clauses that allow access to sub suppliers that are used by your direct suppliers and require that they flow these clauses down to them. The Warehouse Distributor Inc. sells products to Sales Direct, who is your direct distributor. Sales Direct flows down contract clauses to the Warehouse Distributor Inc., which allows you to access their facility for assessment. If you were assessing the Warehouse Distributor Inc., what might you review to understand if they were receiving substandard or counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect items? You can pause here if discussing with a group, but I am going to discuss a few tips. Look at specific product lines and ask for their sources. Who do they get their products or items from? Do they use their other distributors or go direct to manufacturers? Do they have invoices, certificates of conformance, or other documents from manufacturers? Substandard materials that are ordered will likely not have documentation, such as the genuine materials that the company receives directly from the manufacturers. Documentation, when compared, if they do have it, may look altered or different from manufacturer documentation. When comparing prices or costs of materials from manufacturers to other sources, is there a vast difference? This could be another indicator of potential fraudulence or counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. When planning for acquisition clauses and use, you might consider some of the following: clauses for specific scenarios or requirements, who reviews the clauses and changes, when they are used, what is the approach to clause use, and how is this understood, and is there training? Inspection and verification plans and procedures might define who will be performing the inspections. Will inspection be performed internal or external to the organization? What will be inspected? And to what requirements? Who is defining the requirements? Your organization or a customer? When will the inspection be performed? Is there a defined timeline? Where will the inspection be performed? In a temperature controlled environment or out in the field during maintenance operations? Why is the inspection being completed? Is it required by the customer or is it an internal requirement? Where can they look to find the details of these internal or external requirements? And do they know how? How will the item or materials be inspected? Will they use visual, dimensional, non destructive, or destructive testing methods? Now we are at stage 3 of the risk mitigation plan. This stage relates to planning for the controlling and managing of the products and processes to mitigate the risk of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. Process considerations might include traceability control, material and parts control, obsolescence management, and nonconformance management. Let's review these processes in more depth. Product traceability allows you to track your inventory movements from end to end, meaning you can track products to where they were shipped or back through their operational steps. Traceability may show the chain of custody, but it does not indicate whether the part has been properly packaged, stored, or handled, or whether it has been tampered with along the way. Trusted sources throughout the supply chain need to maintain effective material controls to ensure appropriate material handling and storage, and to ensure material with traceability is not commingled with material without traceability. Material and parts control processes may include planning for product handling, which could also include handling nonconforming materials and counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. Storage. This may include the storage of all items, but could also include specifics to nonconforming materials and counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. Inventory validation, which may include inspection of inventory for counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, inventory processes that could preclude other fraudulent activities, such as accurate counts, estimates, or traceability activities. Even if inventory validation is completed on a sampling basis, it is still valuable for businesses that acquire or hold inventories, especially if a large inventory is maintained or if inventory is used in critical applications. And assessment of product change notices, recalls, or product alerts, and implementation of lessons learned, best practices, and other operating experience. Obsolescence refers to materials, parts, devices, software, services, and processes that become non procurable from their original manufacturer or supplier. Obsolescence management is an important element to any counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item prevention program. Obsolescence has been proven to contribute significantly to counterfeit issues, and studies completed in the past by the U.S. Government Accountability Office demonstrated that when obsolete electronic components are procured, they're highly likely to be counterfeit. GAO created a fictitious company and gained membership to two internet platforms, providing access to vendors selling military grade electronic parts. GAO requested quotes from numerous vendors to purchase a total of 16 parts from three categories. The first category was authentic part numbers for obsolete and rare parts. The second category was authentic part numbers with post production date codes. These are date codes after the last date the part was manufactured, which means they were requesting parts that could not possibly exist unless the company came back with the proper date codes. And the third category was bogus or fictitious part numbers that are not associated with any authentic parts. To determine whether the parts received were counterfeit, GAO contracted with a qualified independent testing lab for full component authentication analysis of the first two categories of parts, but not the third because those were all bogus part numbers. The part numbers have been altered for the reporting purposes in that report, but 100% of all the parts received were counterfeit. There are several drivers for component obsolescence, such as the growth rate of technology, competitive life cycles, policies, legislation, and planned obsolescence by the manufacturer. It is critical that organizations manage obsolescence using a defined process, such as through a process shown planning, designing, checking, and acting. Obsolescence plans should address at a minimum communications that are used or received, such as product change notices or PCNs, and end of life notices, such as EOLs. Alternatives this could be an alternative product, alternative manufacturer, alternative design executions if a product runs out or is discontinued, and obsolescence timelines. There are various methodologies and tools available to forecast obsolescence timelines. Proactive obsolescence management is best addressed at the design phase. Proactive management of obsolescence requires the identification of critical parts that are at a high risk of going obsolete, will have an insufficient quantity available after obsolescence to satisfy expected demand, and will represent a problem to manage if and when they become obsolete. During this phase, parts can better be identified and a management plan set up prior to an actual obsolescence event. Proactive management does not require an ability to forecast the obsolescence risk for parts. There are many methods and tools available for this forecasting, such as obsolescence risk and life cycle, time series modeling, machine learning, etc. The check process consists of verifying notices such as alerts, product change, product end of life, such as previously discussed, usage reports and documents to know where the items have potentially been used and may need to be mitigated, and where in inventory are obsolete products on hand. Are there spares, and how long will spares last? ACT is our actions for designing refresh timelines into original design concepts or understanding what parts are most likely to go obsolete and need redesign and design for potential removal or replacement of those items in the future. Stockpiling may be another option. Some items can be stockpiled for long periods of time. If you have an idea of maintenance schedules, or if the part is replaced infrequently and can be stored for long periods of time, then this is an option. Planning for nonconformances is also an important aspect to counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item prevention and control. What is a nonconformance? A nonconformance is a failure to meet a specified requirement. Why is it important to have an effective nonconformance process? Counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items may be identified as a nonconformance, and if this process is effective, then the counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items will be processed accordingly and identified. Effective processes will perform analysis of metrics to determine if there are trends, which should be reviewed in depth. Some nonconformance issues that occur over time may be indicators of fraudulent activities. This could be that a supplier is consistently providing the wrong materials, delivering substandard products, or delivering items that have to be returned to them. Tracking nonconformance related issues may reveal trends. Tracking issues such as return material authorizations, specific nonconformance issues related to vendors, and costs associated with rework, extra testing and inspection related to discrepant materials may also reveal trends that could be related to counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, and this could require more in depth scrutiny. A risk mitigation plan might include the following steps and defined process. And this is continued from the last slide. This is stage 4, report and analyze. And this is handling counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, reporting and collaboration, investigating counterfeit and fraudulent suspect item reports, and monitoring and trending. Handling counterfeit and fraudulent suspect item processes may include identifying or defining how items will be segregated. There may be limits on what can or should be segregated and where this can or will occur. How access may be limited to items to prevent use. Maybe only a few people have access to where items are segregated to prevent use, or maybe individuals are trained not to access the area. How items may be tagged. The tag should clearly define the status of the item and any other pertinent information. It is always recommended that the person who applies the tag is also named on the tag so that they can be contacted about the item or the tag, and how many items and how items will be marked. This could include cases when they are stored, segregated, tagged, or if they are evaluated to be used as is or remain in place. Processes for reporting and collaboration may also be documented. Process may document how your organization will interact with federal and commercial entities, in addition to any tools that will be used to promote internal and external communication of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. Depending on your location, there may be several tools available for collaboration. Law enforcement entities may also work directly with consumers in some countries and locations, where in other locations, these entities may be more separated. Various investigations may take place from or at the local organization all the way through national law enforcement levels. For all investigations, it is important to have a defined process. A defined process may include evidence, maintenance, and storage. How are items and information, if the issue were to go to law enforcement, going to be handled? Is there documentation that is needed, such as chain of custody forms or tracking forms for who has the items and where it has been? And documentation, maintenance, and retrieval. Who maintains records and documents related to counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items? Are documents traceable to the item or investigation? Internal processes should be well documented and understood by those who will use these processes. This may mean that additional training is required for these individuals. Although monitoring and training may be performed at any of the stages or steps, this can be broken down into a simple four-step process, which includes information gathering, analysis, results, and implementation of actions. When developing our processes for monitoring and trending, we may consider each of the following steps: information gathering. Are issues or information is monitored and tracked? How are they tracked? What systems are used or are available? Analysis. How is this information analyzed? Is there a specific technique that is used? Is the technique documented? Who analyzes this information? Results. Do individuals know what to review and how to validate results? What will happen with the outputs and the results? Do they go into a report? Do they go into a system? How are these easily navigatable and viewable? And implement the actions. Is there a plan to implement or use data to implement actions? Do actions need to be implemented based on the data? We have discussed all four stages of risk mitigation planning and what you might include. Stage one was identifying the risk. Stage two was preventing and detecting counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. Stage three was controlling and managing processes that will prevent and detect counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. And stage four was reporting and analyzing trends of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items and other processes. I always recommend to pause here and discuss as a group. Any questions or discussion topics? This is the halfway point of this training, and we will pause here for a break before continuing into section 3.